Welcome everyone to Hewson Rowe. This is a podcast where you get the resources you need to fuel your awakening process, optimize health, and enjoy higher experiences of your own divine nature. Today we have a guest with us on the show, Davidya Buckland from Canada, and we're going to be talking about refined perception. Andrew?
Yes. Hey, Dorothy. Hey, everybody. We're honored to have David with us here today. David is an author. He's written a book, Our Natural Potential. He's currently writing two more, is what I hear. And he's also the author of a blog, Davidya.ca. And he speaks from the direct recognition and realization of his infinite nature and his cognition of the various details of how reality is unfolding. So we're very grateful to have you with us, David, to speak about the subject of refined perception.
Well, thank you, Andrew and Dorothy. Refined perception essentially means being able to perceive those levels of existence more subtle than the physical, more manifest than consciousness. Dorothy has a model she uses. She often holds her fingers up, and for the layers, talk about those layers. And so, in meditation practice, we culture, for example, our awareness of consciousness, and we drop through those layers and gradually clear any impediments we have through that process and open those up to our general awareness. Now, there's a few things about this that's important to understand. One, for example, is that development of consciousness and refinement of perception are both cumulative through lifetimes. So we're not all born in the same place. We kind of pick up where we left off, so to speak. Although there can be some karmic dynamics that take place through a life before they come online, so to speak, or before they become more obvious. And sometimes they're present early on in life as a child, and then as we grow into school age, we shift into a mind emphasis, and that tends to overshadow them for a while until we do things, culture techniques or whatever, that bring them back online, or something happens, some experience that jolts them forward or something like that. But they're all available to us if we culture the groundwork and prepare the ground for them.
David, what do you see? Do you see a relationship between senses of perception and the 5 primal elements? Do you have any take on that, the relationship between those?
Well, there is a direct relationship. I mean, the Vedic philosophy is that the senses, or each of the 5 senses, are attuned to the 5 elements. So sight is attuned to the fire element, for example, and sound to, hearing to sound, the space element. And of course, it's attuned to sound, the space element, and smell to earth, and taste to water, and so on. So there's this basic idea that they're attuned. However, it is useful to note that different people have a different emphasis in their sensing, a different prominent sense, dominant sense. Like, I'm very visual, and so there's the habit of perceiving that way. And so as I've refined perception, I've tended to see things more. Whereas some people are more feeling, for example. They feel their way into more refined things. And some people are more sound oriented, and so on. Those 3 are the more prominent ones, and they're the 3 most subtle as well of the senses. Sound is actually the most subtle. They talk about the primordial sound and the first becoming the vibration on that finest level, and so being able to perceive on that level, sound is optimum.
Beautiful. I was just wondering if there was a connection between the experience of expansion of consciousness and the experience of refined perception. And that's, yeah.
Yeah, I would say yes, but they're entwined, but they're distinct.
Oh,
And I think that's important to understand, because sometimes in some traditions they're seen as essentially the same, but they're kind of like the masculine and the feminine sides of the process. We can go into that more in a moment, but essentially that process of practices like meditation and that bring us in contact with our essential nature, that process of transcending through the layers creates purification during the process and gradual clearing. There's also the idea they talk about in the Vedic tradition of the gunas. They're essential qualities on a very deep level in consciousness that give something its essential nature. But in a human physiology, most of us are dominant in what's known as tamas, or inertia, that which keeps us solid and grounded. So it's all of these gunas are valuable, but the key is the right balance. And then there's the transformational guna of rajas, of fire, of movement, that transfers from one to the other. And then you have sattva, purity or clarity. So in a meditation or a spiritual practice, there's that movement towards experiencing our essential nature, but through that process, we're also purifying the various layers of our own physiology, which allows us to experience those layers more clearly. So there's a key relationship between clarity, sattva, and refined perception, the ability to perceive on those levels.
It sounds like there's also a relationship between the three gunas and the elements, right? Because you were saying like Rajas is like the transformational, guna is more fiery, like that.
Yeah, so it's strong association with sight, as an example there. Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head the associations. That's an Ayurvedic idea. They talk about the relationship between the gunas and the prakritis, or doshas, the nature of our physiologies. But that also has a relationship with the elements as well. So there's kind of this transformation that takes place in our physiology, where we get less and less mass oriented, inertia oriented, and more light, and we kind of gradually move up the elemental scale, you could say. And so that water becomes more dominant, and then fire more dominant, and then air more dominant, and then finally space becomes the dominant element. And then from that level, that's where you get these stories of the old yogis and siddhas and things who could do all kinds of stuff, because if your body is not dominantly physical or that way, then it's far more flexible to do things. If that makes any sense. In very brief.
So much sense. It makes so much sense. So, the question in my mind, because, I'm thinking about our listeners and how anybody listening to this talk has an interest in cultivating or developing a refined perception themselves. And so my question to both of you guys, I mean, I know I have my own answers, of course, but I would like to hear you guys' answers, of what that process might look like, and how it might relate to how the person interacts with their world, or the process of developing refined perception, that is.
Well, it's interesting because I'd never heard refined perception categorized as a distinct topic before I came across you guys. So, and that I wasn't exposed to Maharishi's teaching or anything before that. So when I came across you guys, I sort of was exposed to that, and it was just taken for granted here that it was a part of the unfoldment, a part of the process. And but it made a lot of sense as I was sort of watching different presentations on YouTube and things that seemed to be lacking in detail, that there could also be unfoldment where this wasn't taking place. And so, as David was saying, it correlates with masculine and feminine development.
Oh.
And and the degree of the fullness and the depth of the realization. And the feminine side of things tends to correlate with healing or resolution of unresolved material, similar to what David was saying about those how would you say, the layers that are obscuring the clarity of the becoming of conscious awareness. And so as attention is given to that unresolved material, and it's allowed and released and resolved and transmuted, then typically the senses tend to reflect that. So they reflect that, and there's a refined capacity in the cognitive abilities of conscious awareness experiencing itself. And of course, there's a lot of layers of depth in that, and it's very appropriate at certain points to be in spaces where perhaps there's less emphasis on the details, and we go through ebbs and flows and sort of different periods, and they're all to be appreciated in their own way. We might say that without the stability of that rock solid masculine ground, that pure, changeless, silent awareness, the refined perception has the potential to be not always the most helpful thing. We know of cases where where there's refined perception without that ground, and without that stability. And so it's having both. It's the marriage of both the masculine and the feminine, and that enables the refined faculties to come online in a way which is really supportive of the process and supportive of the deepening and the enrichment. And it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling, self-validating flow, because as the capacity to cognize the details comes online in a new way, then that enables the healing to take place in a new way, that enables the resolution to take place in a new way. And so therefore it sort of feeds that flow of resolution, and then it expresses even more in the capacity to receive the details, and that is different for everyone as well. We've spoken before about how there's certain niches, and we'll sort of be drawn to certain areas, and the refined perception may end up being apparently more concentrated in a certain region of the conscious experiencing, as is appropriate to the physiology and the karmic sort of background and unfoldment, and what is in alignment with the whole, and serves the conscious experiencing, exploring its own potential, and the mind of divinity sort of making sure that all of the different areas are checked out,
Yeah, when you've got a field of infinity, it's almost impossible to explore all of it,
Right.
layers and layers of infinity. So there tends to be that emphasis of one layer or another. Like Dorothy, for example, has explored the whole thing around healing quite a lot because of her work, and but also her interest. It's led her, and her inclinations have led her into that. My focus has been more on the more subtle levels, and the way consciousness becomes. And that's fascinated me a great deal. So there's been more development or perception in those subtlemost levels, and everybody's process is a little different, and what they bring out of that as well. And perhaps Dorothy, you'd like to talk a little bit about each layer?
Oh yeah, I could do that. But I just did want to make add my own like little piece to what you guys both said, which is that when Andrew, you were talking about the marriage of the masculine and feminine, it made me think about the acts of devotion as a vehicle for the development of refined perception. Because if we think of devotion as service and love, the marriage of service and love, then we kind of have the service, which is sort of masculine, knowledgeable and resourceful and orderly and providing, and then with love, which is more that feminine side. And that when the activities or the behaviors are performed from a level where these two have combined, have married, then what happens is even the most mundane activity on the surface, even something simple like, cleaning the floor or going for a walk, or even simple things, when the action is performed with the addition of the heart value, that the heart value helps to cultivate awareness of the finer nuances of that experience. I would say the potential of that action to integrate one's own divine nature. That the love helps, it's like it creates a context. So that as one is performing that simple, oh, I'm cleaning the floor, oh, but the beloved floor, and then as it's going on, all of a sudden it's like you realize, oh, and the pieces of wood on my floor were made from trees, and these trees have life story in them. And as I'm cleaning my floor, I realize I'm feeling the story of the life that was in those trees. And, and from that point on, you don't even walk on the floor anymore without really appreciating that floor, man. Anyway, yeah, we could do a quick review. In fact, I think I have a chart I can share with everybody.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say while you're pulling that up, Dorothy,
about
the devotion fitting into mind perception. It's also common for there to be a correlation when there's certain flows of devotion like prayer and sincere singing or worship. Also for there to be the refinement of perception as well. Just because it does correlate with the culturing of the qualities of the heart, and allows for the purification of the physiology in a different way.
It's so blissful too.
Mm-hmm.
The part of the
it is
dopamine is like just right back here, just like right behind the vocal mechanism. So when you sing, like all the tissues of the brain just they hum, and it like vibrates up the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, which start producing dopamine in large quantities, and just the bliss it flows. It's very sweet. All right, so here's this chart. Let's see, I think I'm going to just move my mic out of the way here a little bit so we can see. So this is a diagram of one of the ways we can sort of slice up the field of consciousness and I think I can use a...
Yeah, it's useful to note that it's like a rainbow. How many colors are there in a rainbow?
Right?
It depends on how detailed and sharp it is and so on like that, or how you want to divide it. Like a number of people talk about this in what they call a three worlds model, where they talk about it really simple, physical, subtle, and divine, or consciousness, or something like that. And there's variations on that, but they make it really simple. But if you want to understand what you're experiencing and what's clear and not clear and so on like that, I personally have found it much more valuable to divide it up a little further.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are people who divide even more. Like I was looking up the concept of koshas at one point online, and found that in the Indian tradition there are like 5 koshas, but in the Buddhist tradition there's like 33. So, but really the range, the extreme ends of the range stay basically the same, which is you've got like sort of because I'm using my pen as a pointer here, use like the physical material body at the surface, and then the etheric body that's like an energy map of the physical body, and then the mental body that's comprised of conscious mind, subconscious, unconscious, and I include in there avenue of awareness, because the field, the connection to the field is also, I think, part of that story. And then the emotional body, because as we go down, it gets more abstract, right? So the
people can confuse. People can confuse mind awareness with actual awareness because of that.
Right, exactly. Beautiful. So as not to get confused. And emotional body is like the body of desire and all the feelings, the feeling level, a lot of feeling going on there at the body. And then the astral body, and right there's kind of like a gap in a way. We can think of the upper 4 layers of the physiology to correlate with present life, present self, what we know ourselves to be as an individual, and then the deeper layers of this spectrum to be more collective levels of self. So at the astral body level, we connect in with the web of life, and consciousness tends to take on the appearance of threads or streams, channels, filaments that move, And then at the causal body level, we come to also known as the finest level of feeling. So here we've got lots of feelings that we can identify, but here at the finest feeling level, very deep feeling level, causal is the body so abstract. It's so close to the absolute, it's so close to unmanifest being that the body looks kind of like an ocean, and it's full of regions. And at this point, I was thinking, David, of your point that consciousness is just so big. How can we really explore all of it? But one of the ways we handle the fact that our causal bodies are so expanded is we work with it in terms of regions. And there's a lot to be said about that. But to move on, the 2 deeper layers, 7 and 8, these are the 2 layers of unmanifest being prior to the manifest process, but prior to manifestation. And, the resting silence level is that unknowable aspect of creation, which is indescribable. Although, David, you're so good at describing it, I bet you can describe it for us.
And I never say anything is unknowable.
I know, right? Because somehow we know it, right?
We are it. So we
are it, yes.
So it's just a matter of increasing clarity, increasing refinement, and
because the point is
are it, so we can know it.
Here is the foundation of all this, and all this manifestation comes out of and is the expression of this unmanifest level.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And the idea that consciousness is the source, when all we're aware of is the physical, and we're aware of the content of some of those other layers, like we're aware of emotions, we're aware of thoughts, and some of the other inner content. But refinement allows us to actually see or feel or hear or whatever on those different levels, and become aware of how that consciousness moving starts to vibrate and goes through this process of making the world around us, and it quite changes our perspective of the world. Looping, I actually, just to touch on this briefly, I use a similar model, but I use a 7-layer version of the koshas, also from the sort of Vedic tradition. It's one of those interesting things when you're self-realized or even in unity consciousness, as the stages of enlightenment, you perceive consciousness as infinite and eternal. So how could there be it's the source. But from a further perspective, it turns out consciousness itself has an origin, and in that model, so consciousness is the 7th kosha, which means sheath. So it's the kind of the 7th layer within Brahman, essentially. So I use a very similar model. I use a couple of the terms differently, but yeah, very similar otherwise. Again, it's like, how are you, counting the colors of the rainbow? Right. But I wanted to loop back slightly to the masculine and feminine part, and you were talking about the heart and so on. It's one of the things that's really interesting to understand is what I refer to as modes of perception. And essentially, Maharishi referred to them as the personal and the impersonal. So essentially, we can perceive the world through 2 primary modes of seeing, and these are very much like the masculine and feminine as well. You can frame it that way also. Essentially, the impersonal is the dominant mode in the West. It's essentially seeing the world through the eyes of the intellect and the mind, distinguishing this from that, right from wrong, different colors, and distinguishing, separating, and so on. And it's a very useful mode for making decisions about direction or this kind of thing on that level. But the personal is a whole different mode, and it's essentially seeing with the heart, and it's seeing with refined perception, using the heart through the mode of refined perception to experience the world. One of the referring back to explain this a little bit better. One of the things that takes place in the involving enlightenment, when we first wake up, or perhaps beforehand as well, but when we first wake up to our true nature as consciousness, there's a recognition that I'm not the doer. We realize that through all this time, there's the ego has been claiming what I did, and these are my thoughts, and these are my emotions, and I did that, and all this kind of thing. And we may have a story about it was the right thing to do, or we may have a story about, oh, I did a bad thing again, or whatever. We make different stories about that, but it essentially has been claiming all our actions as doing. But with awakening, we step back into consciousness itself, and there's kind of in that mode, in that stage, we're in kind of an observer state. And so we're observing life as it is, without all the interpretation of the mind. And we realize that we're not the doer, we're the observer from that perspective. And that our body continues to act, our thoughts continue to happen, our emotions continue to happen, but they're not mine in the same way. They're perceived differently. Now, I explain all that as a precursor to understand what takes place in that stage is there's a greater emphasis on refined perception, because the question can come up. So if I'm not doing the doing, what is doing the doing? How is the doing happening? How is the world taking place and all this stuff happening if I'm the observer and not the doer? And that ties directly back to that personal mode, where we can experience the world of the doers, of the laws of nature, or the devas, which means light beings, or there's a number of ways people talk about this in traditions around the world. But essentially, it's a mode where we experience the mechanics of creation on a more personal level, and we can have relationships and interact with the laws of nature. So, for example, if we're driving our car, we primarily need to be in the impersonal mode to make decisions about where to turn and, but when we're walking down the street and we see a beautiful flower, or actually the example you had actually of washing the floor, and then you're connecting with the qualities of the life of the tree. The tree lived before it became a floor. And that's an aspect of refined perception, but also of the personal, because you're relating to the actual life that's behind it's not just on the level of, oh, these are the principles that make up this wood, but it's like the qualities, the personal qualities of the wood and what it has. And I'm sure you also have the ability to tune into the nature of the laws of nature involved in that tree as well. So there's a whole dynamic, but so there's kind of way more detail and information when you can communicate with the weather, for example, aspects of the weather. But for day-to-day life and routine things, it can be too much information, basically. So it's useful to be able to shift back and forth between those modes. But it's just about, and that's just about attention. Are you thinking through the mind, or are you thinking, well, thinking is the wrong, or are you flowing through the mind, or are you flowing through the heart? It's kind of like a shift of focus, and that changes our mode.
Maybe it is a kind of thinking, though, David, because our hearts have a big neural network around them.
Yes.
And so, I think there is a kind of heart intelligence.
Oh, yes, very much.
Energy healing point of view, yeah.
Yeah, very much, but it's not a thinking, and like you don't want to mistake thinking for the heart. A lot of people do that.
Yeah, it's not the same kind of prefrontal cortex type of activity.
It's more intuition.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing is that the intellect and the intuition essentially function on the same level. They're essentially the personal and the impersonal modes of the heart and the heart chakra. And so it's they're closely tied to that. But it's just amazing. It's just like there's this shift. I mean, we can see the world as a pretty dry place sometimes and harsh. But when we shift into the personal mode, it all comes alive, and it's just full of life. And on all those different levels that you were showing earlier, all of them have life on them in different forms. And
in fact, my experience is the deeper you go, the more concentrated the life value is. So
Right.
as you go deeper and deeper, it's like thicker and thicker and more overlapping and all that. By the time you get down to the causal level, it's just like a humming, buzzing field of life force.
Yes.
And then you get into the field of being, and there's only being. There's only life. That's all it is.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, at deep levels, it's like the beings become like points of intelligence. They're coming back to their essential nature. They don't even need a body and all like that. They can just be a point of intelligence, and with specific qualities. And by interacting with other points, they create the structure of the world around us.
Yeah.
They interact, and it gives rise to a kind of a motion of the relationship, which ultimately becomes the threads of the astral field.
Right. The sacred geometry, people call that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Next, more manifest level of the field. And
One
did
thing,
you jump in?
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say something.
I can
I
tell.
remember. Started looking at what you were describing there.
I know, right? It's kind of distracting.
Okay, yeah, no. In reference to what David's saying about the personal, I think it's important to point out that this is kind of like impersonally personal. So, and it depends on where someone is at in the unfoldment. So let's say it from a space of egoic dominance, where they still feel like there's a separate me here, so on and so forth. If there is refined perception, then the relating on the personal level is going to be different from if there's already been the initial shift, and they recognize that even though there's this personal quality and ability to relate to the appearance of creation on a personal level, it is impersonal because it's within the self, and it is yourself. So it's almost like you're having conversations with yourself and interacting with yourself in more of a personal way. Yes. But it doesn't overshadow the clarity that there's only one self, and that it is all your own conscious awareness. So that's an important piece there.
I think that's one of the biggest pieces, man.
Yeah, you touched on that earlier. You touched on that earlier, the importance of the grounding of the masculine, so the feminine can flower. And that's exactly, so like I mentioned, also too much information, if you're experiencing all these subtle levels and you don't have that grounding at the bottom of the chart, then you can be tossed around. You're in the feeling and the mind values without that foundation grounding underneath that. Then you're basically just pushed around by the experiences, and it's just more layers of drama and potential suffering that can take place in that. But yeah, so that grounding, that combination of grounding in source and then bringing out all the layers in between. And it's not something we have to chase. If we have appropriate spiritual techniques and approaches, and we do some healing, then this stuff's going to open up to us naturally. It's not something we have to go after ourselves. And actually, that's probably the better approach, because then it unfolds naturally when it's appropriate, as opposed to showing up at some other place and causing distortion. It's kind of like hallucinogenic drugs can open things up, but it's a very distorted perception. I mean, that's an exaggeration.
Well, there's no integration of the nervous system to go with it. The thing is,
it tends to traumatize the nervous system.
Right. It actually damages the nervous system, which is an important part of stabilizing the experience.
Yeah. So the key part with refinement of perception is that
healthy nervous system is part of it.
Yeah, it's a healthy nervous system and clean. Not you don't have to be perfectly physically healthy, but it's those layers in between, healing the heart and and those inner layers that we talked about, so that the light can shine through, so to speak. The refinement can be seen, because it's like if on those very fine levels, like the causal, there's these fine vibrations and these fine relationships on the level just above that. We were talking about if the mind is, then there's no opportunity for that to be heard. So it's being able to settle the emotions in the mind, and then those more subtle levels, they become obvious because they're there all the time. They're with us all the time. It's just that they're, underneath the monkey mind, they're not recognized.
My experience in the healing field is that when the perception is awakened and open to the very finest levels of creation but as Andrew, as you were saying, it isn't, the connection to wholeness isn't stabilized, then this gives rise to very kind of certain types of specific imbalances. And one of them is I get contacted by so many people who say, oh, some kind of entities are bothering me. They come at night or some evil person is trying to psychically attack me or something like these types of experiences. Because at that point, if there's no connection or grounding to the infinite, the source of the resource, the infinite resource of one's own being, some kind of patterning of separated type of patterning that's existing down at that very fine level can seem quite scary. And so what's required is the anchor into wholeness.
But also the healing aspect too, because it's the unresolved stuff that's in there that can attract some of that. Because it can start showing up in that kind of way. And so if the healing is taking place, then there isn't going to be those magnets is the wrong word, but there isn't going to be the energy that's going to attract that kind of stuff. And so then it's safe and clear. And also we have grounding in the light. Then if there's light, then there isn't darkness.
I was going to say that even at the subtlest level, every aspect and every expression of divinity is moving towards like full embodiment of divine expression. So even those forms are evolving. Everything's evolving. And everything at that level is an expression of myself. As you just pointed out, there can be some imbalance in one's own self that kind of acts like a magnet or attracts that. And so the experience is an opportunity to bring some very subtle, very delicate fabric of one's own consciousness back into perfect alignment and expression of divinity. Yes.
One thing about that is that, certain so-called entities they're only able to evolve to a certain point based on where they are. So they could be in a limited region and not able to, and sort of, so they're not necessarily like committed to evolution. They're not really interested in your evolution, always. But what David was saying about the, recognizing that it's all within, we sort of supply the ammunition, if you will, for any kind of activity that seems to be disruptive on that level. Also sort of moves us out of any kind of victim position, because it's really through recognizing that it's all within our own experience, whatever seems to be activated or reflected back or whatever the case may be, it's within our own power, if you will, on some level to own that and to see that it's there, and then to take necessary steps to become willing to heal it and resolve it, look at it.
It's interesting to reflect on. When I was a child, I became aware of some of that stuff and had that kind of reaction. It was scary and uncomfortable. Didn't know what to do with it. Interesting, though, basically the feedback I got was it was all my imagination. And so when I stopped accepting it, then it basically stopped showing up in my experience. But interestingly, when that stuff started showing up again, but on a more refined level later on, I was really circumspect about it, because it's like, I had a bad experience with this stuff before, and I don't know about this, and went through a bit of a dance to come to understand that this wasn't the same thing. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like, when you're a kid, your mother gives you basic advice about don't talk to strangers and, stay out of bad neighborhoods and, this kind of thing. And that holds true everywhere. There's beings there's humans that are very supportive and helpful, and there's ones that are less supportive, and others that are happy to mess us around a little bit. And that's true of the all those not deeper levels, but the more surface levels. There's beings that are engaging in evolution, as you mentioned, and there's beings who are not with the program.
That's a great point you make, David, about the circumspect phase that you went through, because sometimes there can be, let's say if someone has had like a renunciate lifetime incarnation and they've been in a setting where the refined value is sort of seen as a distraction or maybe not helpful or whatever the case may be, they could have certain tendencies and aversions towards that kind of material showing up,
Yes.
and move to negate it or feel uncomfortable. And so it's important to recognize that again would be something that is seeking healing, the aversion and the sort of movement to control in that way. But it also can be common if we have been in situations or even in different incarnations, if you will, where there was an unpleasant sort of run-in that had to do with some sort of refined value or something like that. Yeah. So
yeah,
that's important.
Also, I think it's good for people to realize that as human beings, in a sense, we occupy a kind of a greater portion of that spectrum. Remember my chart? Because those beings, those darker entities, will stay down at the finer levels of creation. They don't tend to really come up to the physical material surface, but we do. So essentially, anytime anybody bumps into some kind of energy that seems unpleasant, it's good to know that you are bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yes.
you range all the way to the physical material and all the way down. So there's I think an illusion, there's some illusory value almost always associated with those types of energies, which, it's good for us as humans to kind of get past that illusion. And I think just like you did, David, when you were little, to just like, well, don't hang out with them. It's good to get past that idea or illusion that I somehow identify with that darkness. Ooh, that's some, scary part of me that I don't ever want. Just knowing that you have all the resources. Basically, we have all the resources and more to have infinite access to infinite resources to deal with these types of energies.
Yeah, there's something important you touched on in there too, and that is not only do we have that range and that ability to ground in source, but we have the ability to produce this subtle substance that's been called Soma or Amrita. This is the nectar of the gods, or the fountain of immortality, as it's been called as well. And there's been people have been chasing some literal fountain in somewhere when it's actually inside. but yeah, so it's essentially there's a process inside that allows us to produce this really refined substance, pre-physical, very subtle, which dramatically it's produced primarily when we transcend. And then after we wake up, we're essentially transcending all the time. And so it becomes more and more common. And that really helps with that shift into sattva and refinement and so on like that. But what it also does is it feeds the laws of nature and our physiology. And so it helps, it essentially, it upgrades the food we're feeding them. And makes them stronger and more able to support us. And it helps other ones that don't value that to move off. And it attracts other laws of nature, essentially our ability to get things done and to have insights and to organize or deeply feel or shift towards forgiveness and compassion and those kinds of things. they all revolve around that refinement of our physiology. So it's one of those interesting dynamics. It's kind of, you mentioned, Andrew, about in some traditions where they discourage this kind of thing because of the potential hazards, some of which we're talking about here, as distractions on the spiritual path. And yeah, I would agree that chasing them directly is probably a mistake, because then you're basically looking for another form of experience. You're chasing experiences, and experiences are not source. They're not going to wake you up. They're not going to get you there. But if you have a practice that takes you into source and develops that, and in the process is healing and refining, through the process of transcending and going beyond the mind and all the going through those layers and down into source. We don't necessarily have to be aware that we're going through those layers. That develops with refined perception. But that really that brings the balance. That brings them both together. And then when this stuff shows up, it's much more likely to be in balance and appropriate to the time and be developing naturally. And then it basically, you see descriptions of people awakening, and they describe this really flat, dry form of awakening where it's just pure consciousness. Everything else is an illusion. It's only the self and nothing else is real. That's really not the fullness of what's possible. And certainly that can show up that way, but it can evolve. And if we add the feminine into that, then it's going to bring out these layers, and it brings this richness. And it's, some people get the idea that, well, maybe, after I'm enlightened, then I'll have no mind and I'll have no emotions, and it'll be just really, simple. And that is simple, but it's also really, really dry. And so really, it's not that your mind goes away. It's your identification with it falls away, and then the mind can be there as it is. And that was one of the things I used to think, that I have to get rid of this mind. I have a really strong mind, and so it was kind of in the way a little bit, it seemed to me. But of course, it was the mind that was thinking itself was in the way. It was the mind that was trying to control the mind. It's little circles and that kind of stuff can go in. But it's that attachment to the mind that's the issue. And same with the emotions. I found that the emotions have become bigger, richer, and fuller, and that I have access to emotions that really weren't there before. And so there's a richness to life that wasn't there before. And that quality of bliss, they talk about, nirvana in Buddhism, or Satchidananda in the Vedas, absolute bliss consciousness. That enlightenment is bliss, and that bliss is that finest level, the causal, the bliss body, the fine vibration. We talked about different points in this conversation. That's the same thing, and essentially that's there all the time, in behind all our experience. But again, because of all the noise of the mind and the emotions from all these unresolved experiences from our history, we're not aware of it. But as that settles out, then it just becomes this ongoing companion in behind everything. And of course, sometimes it's more dominant, and sometimes it's more background. And we get very focused on something. We're not thinking about, am I happy or not? It's just there, and that just brings out this richness to life enlightenment has historically been seen as this rare, special thing.
Right.
But it's actually been more about the cycles of consciousness. Consciousness has kind of seasons in the collective, in the larger sense of humanity as a whole. And we have a winter, and we have a spring and a summer. However, in the models of consciousness, the summer is much, much longer than the winter. But we're kind of rising out of a winter time, and so there's a lot of this stuff has become less accessible. But that's changed a lot in the last decade or so, and now people are waking up all over the place. Even people without a spiritual practice, particularly, just
That's right.
kind of drops out of the sky, so to speak. All of that ties back to, picking up where we left off and bringing forward prior life development. But yeah, it's just amazing. I mean, I see people waking up all the time, and because I write about it, I got people contacting me, and and because there's often these concepts people have about what it's supposed to be like, or that there's no human here anymore, or something like that, and so they have to get out, work it out, and and they joke about it being like nothing changes, and yet everything changes. And essentially, it's because our life and our humanity is the same, but where we're experiencing it from changes. And this isn't some dramatic, unexpected thing. It's actually, most people are surprised by how totally normal and ordinary it is when they shift. But it's, you think about like our childhood. We were a toddler at one point, and we saw the world in a certain way, and then we were I don't know what's in there, school age child, and then a tween, and then a teen, and each of those brings an evolving perspective. But if we don't develop that connection with who we are within, we tend to stall out. In our adulthood, we get to a certain point, and psychology is very familiar with this. We tend to stall out at a certain point in the stages of psychological development. But if we're culturing that inner connection with who we are, then our development can kick back in again, and get moving, and bring out that sense of who we are, and also that refinement of perception to bring that fullness and richness to life. Well, I got on a roll there.
Beautiful. Oh, so beautiful, David. I was thinking of questions to ask you, and then you would just answer it before I even asked. Really sweet.
One thing that I'll mention is just kind of going back to what we were talking about before, and the possible limitations of refined perception, or different things we could run into. The cultivation of discernment is something that also can begin to take place with the refinement of the intellect, we might say, and the alignment of the intellect with what we recognize ourselves to be. So as we realize ourselves to be infinite, and the self itself, as the self wakes up to itself, then the intellect can begin to sort of align itself with that recognition, with that realization, and that brings on a new level of discernment. So we're less and less mistaken about appearances, and we see the essence. We see what the actuality is versus what perhaps is being presented, and those different kinds of things.
Good point. Yeah.
So that's a very very important aspect of the process, and then also there's, in terms of refined perception, there's lots of variation within the realm of perceiving subtle beings. According to the spiritual tradition, there's going to seem to be variation. So it on the context of the impressions and the sort of coagulated point value of that package, and the background influences the way in which the different layers of creation are being perceived, and the different possibilities there. So it's not that any one tradition holds the sort of this is what it is, because divinity, the mind of divinity, as David and I sort of touched on earlier, is moving to explore all of its own infinity, and the various actualizations of its own infinity. And so even within this one planetary system, there is a whole variety of possibilities in terms of its self-reflective dynamism, interacting and cognizing and all of that. And so that can show up in reference to each tradition in a unique way. And then, of course, there's less traditional values of that as well that are possibly able to show up. And then there's another point that I wanted to make in reference to refinement. David was talking about that the more masculine side of awakening, and the flatter, kind of drier, just we might say a bit crisper shift. But there's also there's also another possibility I've been seeing quite a bit of lately, and that's it's a style of shifting that is fluffy and full and vibrant and textured, and this correlates with devotion and a lot of emphasis on resolving unresolved material. And in that, there's a level of refinement which is referential directly to field value. So we can see refinement within the context of form and that includes all of the very subtle layers of the emergence of formation. But then there's also a refined recognition of aspects of infinity. Yeah. And so in the unfoldment of different stages, there can be the refinement that moves in the direction of the ability to so very acutely discern and recognize different aspects of divinity, if you will, and divinity's appearance as the field of conscious awareness. And so I look at those a little bit differently, because one tends to emphasize or sort of focus more in on the value of formation and the conditional aspects of experiencing, and then one is referential to the infinite value. And another.
You're thinking in terms of the motivator behind that form and expression?
Yeah, as far as whether that comes online, is the motivation play into that? Is that what you mean?
Well, what's driving that expression?
What's driving it? Okay, I see
the
what
principle,
you're saying.
you could say.
Driving the formation. Yes, that can be a part of it. And of course, even the way in which the form is appearing can be a part of it. But there's also the ability to recognize different aspects, like the masculine, feminine aspect, which are the only two aspects of conscious awareness, to move back and forth between them spontaneously at will, if you will, and also to recognize very clearly the layering of the expression of divinity as conscious awareness, and then it's layering within conscious awareness. Yeah. So that's something that I tend to focus on when I'm working with when someone is unfolding, and together we sort of energetically align the language with the aspect and are able to move back and forth between the masculine, the feminine, the masculine, the feminine. And someone might say, well, who's doing that? It's just happening, I don't and it also supports the unification of those two aspects. I've found, because there's a recognition of the distinction, and then there's also the sort of ability to release or relax that distinction in its apparent prominence, so that there is a more unified value of realization.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the vision of sort of like the infinity of form versus the infinity of divinity, we want to look at it that way, that it could be that if the story is that there's really only one divine being which is expressing itself as all this infinite form, that it could end up being oh, you've got a little light bubble floating around on you.
Yeah, they do that. They float around, though.
They do. I love that. But that as that is happening, then it could be, like you were saying, kind of a more of an internal shift of whether I'm seeing the infinity of form as the sort of predominating field of my pure awareness, or the infinity of divinity, which is all of that also, like as integrated into all this that we see as the reality of creation. And that what the difference between the exploration of the infinity of divinity versus the exploration of the infinity of the form is actually an internal shift. Could it be? Just a thought.
Yeah.
because your idea is kind of novel to me. I haven't really thought of it in this angle before, so I'm like,
Sure. Yeah, well, it all just depends on where, where someone's at. There's so many different stages and modalities of recognition and realization. So, and things tend to shift. Like an example would be, there can be the sort of direct recognition as the mind of divinity, and the mind of divinity seeing itself, exploring itself. And when I say mind, it's capital M, mind, of divinity. And that is conscious awareness, but it has a different flavor to it when it is held with that capital M mind value. Or there could be the shifting into that which is prior to the mind, looking out into the mind, looking out into the infinite field of mind. So there's mind itself, exploring itself, and perhaps even experiencing itself like an infinite nervous system, like a field value nervous system that's everywhere. And in that, all of the forms could be seen as where the nerve endings of this nervous system are sort of situated, and so there's a sense of the totality of that neuronal network of infinity. Or there can be the sense of that being my mind as divinity. So there's just different variations as far as where we are, in the exploration, or where divinity is in the exploration of herself. Yeah.
There was another thing you said about what it made me think of is that you were talking about how the awakening happening in kind of a systemic way, and even this point about sort of the mind, like the infinite mind or something. And I feel as if you're really touching on such an important understanding of the mechanics of what's happening right now historically, right? Because it's interesting, as that illumination comes in, it shows all the places where corruption is sitting, for example. And I don't need to bring up examples because, they're obvious. Ooh. So, but that part of what we're seeing in the dynamic events that are taking place now within the revealing, or the shining of the light of truth into various collective areas of our world that reveal corruption that's sitting in these various different pockets is actually an expression of the awakening that's happening collectively, internally, for everybody. And I do feel that these events, even though they can be interpreted various ways by various people, I love that we're able to present an interpretation that comes from the angle of them being the physical manifestations of an evolutionary process that's absolutely basic, and I would say essential, to propel our world and our dear family of humanity into a brighter future, into a brighter, better balanced, and more holistic thinking and so forth. And what you've just described, Andrew, is basically the mechanics by which that's happening. So I really think it's really quite brilliant. Thank you for offering that.
I agree. And I would also say that the key part in all this is understanding the principles we've been talking about a little bit, because if you don't understand that that's what's going on, then you can get caught up in the drama. And I get emails from people all the time about that. They're caught up in the drama about what's happening and all the world's going to end tomorrow, and this kind of thing. But if we understand it's a process of purification, that's because collective consciousness, so many people have been waking up that collective consciousness is rising, and it's pulling everybody up with it. When the water rises, all boats rise with it. And so if we understand that, understand those basic principles of healing that you described, Dorothy, so beautifully, then we're able to deal with it as it comes up and process ourselves and then we complete, and then those things wind down and they fall away from our experience, and we become more clear. Perception refines more, and so forth. Quality of life goes up. Whereas if we get caught up in the drama, we're just kind of regurgitating, and we kind of, adding another round of the wheel. And they talk about the wheel of karma going round and round and round, and then we're just engaged in the wheel of karma and drama. And so, what's which would you like? Is to enjoy life or enjoy suffering? Kind of hard to do, actually.
So for our listeners, I'm just gonna reframe what you just said, because it was really brilliant. And that is that and Andrew, you're the one who really inspired me to see this way, actually, based on one of our previous conversations. But as the imbalance or the impurity is rising to the surface to be eliminated, when by flagging, and this is for all our listeners, we're just having the intention to flag that experience as, oh, this is purification. Just knowing, oh, this is purification. Oh no, this isn't my world falling apart and I'm going to die now. Or, this isn't the end of our financial institutions. No, it's just purification. This is purification. And then as soon as that flag surfaces and one realizes, oh, this is just purification, then the flow of awareness, instead of like looping around on that event, it turns inward. And what happens is the imbalance and the impurity rises up. You go, oh, this is purification, and the awareness goes inward, and the imbalance just is the release of the imbalance is facilitated and optimized by taking the inward turn. So as it comes, you go, oh, I see you for what you are. And as the awareness moves deeper in, you as a person access the resources required to support the most graceful and complete release of those impurities. And also, it's like going in helps you like see and appreciate at a very fine level what's going on. So it's integrative to the nervous system, which is part of developing refined perception, right? We integrate the process, and it just saves the psychology and the heart from being gripped and torn up by some event.
Yes, and it's coming up because it's an opportunity to do the healing. It's not coming up because it's a bad time or it's the wrong time. It's coming up because it's a good opportunity now to do that healing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So being able to see the surfacing as surfacing also increases with the refinement of perception, because we begin to recognize things as they're arising in the actual, sort of the root of their arising, and the different. So less and less is there a tendency to mistake them the surfacing to be something that it isn't, and we recognize the process of purification directly. And David was mentioning the different cycles of time earlier, and we could see those cycles actually as basically like a sort of a process of refinement in a certain way, moving from denser into more refined values. It's not necessarily there's ups and downs in that, but as that collective refinement takes place, that correlates with collective surfacing. And that means that the opportunity for healing is there. Are we going to take the opportunity? Because when something surfaces, there's two different options. There's the option to sort of reject it and push it down and try to control it and try to manipulate it and blame someone else. And there's the option to see it as it is, to allow it, to own it, to sort of gently hold it, and let it complete and let it resolve. And I like to, my favorite perspective is one of conversion. So we're basically sitting on a mass pile of convertible material. And,
I love it.
which is really preferable when you want when you're looking for fuel. And so the heart that is committed to truth and aligned with the unfoldment of divinity, of course, is will take all of the fuel that it can get in that process. So we have no shortage of material to work with, and we were very blessed.
Oh God, the relatives. Anyway, I like that because it brings this discussion about refinement of perception to a very practical point. That basically this is, the listeners might be thinking, well, why? I mean, it's kind of fascinating, refined perception, but why bother? But now puts it all in perspective and context. It makes sense that the reason is because the cultivation of refined perception supports the evolutionary process, and the evolutionary process supports the cultivation of refined perception. And as a collective, our ability to navigate through the events which are literally rising right now, presenting themselves for us to deal with. How are we as a collective going to do this in a way that just doesn't get the people who are really committed to the positive change just thrown in jail? Which is kind of like what's been like, we want to be able to support an evolutionary change for our whole society, for our whole culture, for our whole world, that really allows everyone to jump into this train, this evolutionary train, in a way that's graceful and allows a brighter future for everyone, basically.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
I was going to say, and sometimes for people, the first step is the mind. So there's the mind is getting caught up in the drama about something, and so the first step can be, okay, wait a minute, this is a drama. What's behind that, and what's the feeling, and then using the mind to label. Okay, this is fear, this is anger, this is whatever, and then falling a little bit further back, because the mind can't process emotions. It can label them, but it can't process them. So then you go further back and say, and feel the feelings, feel the anger, whatever like that. Not in the drama, not engaging it that way, but just by itself, without the story, without the blah, 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 just with the feeling itself. And that way you can actually experience it. And for a lot of stuff, I was really surprised by this, but for a lot of stuff, they're simply experiencing it by itself, just the feeling value, and it can wash over us in a brief wave. It's done. It's just like a little piece of some incomplete experience that wasn't resolved in the past, and we've just completed it. And sometimes it can be like taking a load off our shoulders, because all that suppression that we've been carrying this stuff around, all that fuel, it has kind of like a weight, and it also requires energy to keep suppressed.
That's right.
And so when we let it go, then that energy is freed up to be used for whatever.
Yeah, my experience is that when these types of more discordant energies manage to be released or dissolve from the system, then just divine being comes in. The silence of being is like you create a vacuum, and then in comes all the light from the source of creation and just floods into those spaces. And then that part of your system, or of your body and your heart and your mind, gets filled with that light. And this is the mechanic of how that process, David, that you mentioned right at the beginning of our session, how the body actually becomes more made of lighter materials, more comprised of the finer, more sattvic materials.
Yeah, and just in that process that David was just describing, what we're really working with is, in a way, it's apparently fragmented or condensated bliss. So as these little shards of concealed bliss surface, and we're able to allow them, then they convert into blissfulness. I mean, it's not, so there's a correlation of the degree of blissfulness and the degree to which we go through the seemingly uncomfortable stuff, that arises. So it takes courage and willingness, but every human being has that ability. And I just wanted to mention also that the higher, we might say, sort of on the other end of the spectrum, values of refined perception and things that have to do with like the divinization of creation and the divinization of the elements. These things run simultaneous with just the basic sort of everyday surfacing. And that is very, very supportive of the transformation of humanity. So that's supporting the recontextualization of the global network. And that also correlates with the degree of surfacing that we're seeing on the more superficial value of experience in the more superficial value of experience. Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. So we
Yeah.
really, oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger, I went to a satsang, and the teacher was taking people back in their emotional experience when they were trying to deal with some trauma or whatever. And it was really fascinating to watch, because every time behind some quality of emotion, it usually evolved back to fear. And then behind that was always happiness or peace.
Mm.
It was like they were all an expression of those flavors, but it was just some expression that hadn't fulfilled itself. And so it kind of is just sitting there, unfinished business, waiting for an opportunity. So we can, when it comes up, we can give it that opportunity.
Mm.
It's beautiful. Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the model that the source of creation is a field of absolute complete fulfillment, and that as the impulses of life force come bubbling up into the manifest field, they come up as there's a separation that takes place in that gap between the unmanifest and the manifest, on my chart, between the resting and dynamic silence and the causal level. There's this aspect of diversification, which is essential to the manifestation of the universe. But as this impulse of absolute, complete, total fulfillment begins to bubble up, it rises in mounting waves of desire until it reaches the surface, where it then appears, then those waves of desire reach their conclusion or their fulfillment. And so the fulfillment, it's actually fulfillment all the way up. It's just that in the interim, it appears as desire, which we've kind of identified mentally as some kind of incomplete experience or state, but it really isn't. It really is just divinity in the way it cycles through its expression from the absolute to the relative.
Yes, I'm just talking about how people will experience it.
Yeah. Me
In the
too.
process, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Beautiful.
all perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's great to have examples. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. It's been wonderful. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone who's participated in today's session. We hope that you can take away some valuable insights and information on how to position yourself to develop and expand your own refined perception, and the incredible value of that, not only for yourself, but also for the whole collective of our world.
Mm.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I always like to just make sure that we give all glory to pure divinity. Yeah. So thank you.